The Andy Griffith Show first debuted on October 3rd, 1960 on CBS. The show followed the lives of the Taylors in the fictional town of Mayberry, North Carolina, starring Andy Griffith as Sheriff Andy Taylor, Don Knotts as Deputy Barney Fife, Frances Bavier as Aunt Bee Taylor, and Ron Howard as Opie Taylor. There were also many lovable recurring characters, such as Gomer Pyle, played by Jim Nabors, and Floyd Lawson, played by Howard McNear. The show's plot followed the life of Andy Taylor, a small-town sheriff, and his deputy Barney Fife as they dealt with small-town predicaments such as moonshiners and the occasional burglar or bank robber. However, the show primarily focused on life lessons and everyday relationships. One of the most popular episodes, called Opie the Birdman, talked about taking responsibility when Opie accidentally killed a mother bird with a slingshot. Opie felt terrible afterwards and ended up raising the baby birds he left motherless while learning a valuable lesson at the same time. When the Andy Griffith Show first aired, it was an automatic hit and was ranked the #1 show for several years. During the early 60s, television sets were starting to become a common household item, so this show aimed to relate to the everyday people watching TV. After Andy Griffith aired, similar shows followed, such as the Beverly Hillbillies and Petticoat Junction, which also followed that same goofy Southern vibe. However, Andy Griffith stayed on top because of how genuine and relatable the characters were. The show even gave Jim Nabors his own spin-off series because the character was so liked, called Gomer Pyle USMC, which followed Gomer and his adventures in the Marines. Debuting on June 20th, 1948, The Ed Sullivan Show was one of the most influential television shows in American history. Guest after guest introduced to the American people through the most direct form of mass communication that existed at the time. The Ed Sullivan Show was the most popular television show of the 20th century, drawing almost 40 million viewers every time the show aired. The show was responsible for the debuts of two of the most influential musical artists of the 20th century, the Beatles and Elvis Presley. Its impact on music and society in general is almost immeasurable, as it was the entire country's sole focus for 23 years. Ed Sullivan was originally disliked by critics, who called him such unsavory names as the Great Stone Face and Night of the Living Ed. However, he won over the hearts of America and will be remembered as the host of one of the most influential talk shows of all time. Star Trek first aired on September 8, 1966 on NBC. The cultural impact of Star Trek is probably the most significant one to come out of this era, and the impact is just as alive today. The show starred William Shatner as the heroic and passionate Captain James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Science Officer Spock, the logical green-blooded Vulcan, and DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. Though these characters are listed as the stars in the opening credits of the show, the other characters were just as important. Nichelle Nichols played Nyota Uhura, James Doohan played Montgomery Scott, George Takei as Hikaru Sulu, and Walter Koenig played Pavel Chekhov. The show's plot surrounded the adventures of the USS Enterprise, a Federation starship from future Earth. Their mission was to, as the show intro states, explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man had gone before. Star Trek had such a big impact not only because of the interesting sci-fi stories inspiring technology, the invention of the mobile phone was inspired by the communicators from Star Trek, but mainly because it was a show that often had social commentary on different issues such as racism and war. The episode Plato's Stepchildren depicted the first interracial kiss on TV between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the show, made sure to show diversity because in the future, everyone would be equal. The fact that Lieutenant Uhura, a black female, had an important role on the bridge of the ship was very progressive during the time, since it was during the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. Whoopi Goldberg was inspired to become an actress because of Nichelle Nichols' role. and would even go on to play as the beloved character Guinan in Star Trek The Next Generation. Star Trek's message of peace, hope, and exploration still impacts viewers today. That's why it has remained so popular, with 7 spin-off series, including one that debuted last fall, 6 movies based off of the original crew, not including 3 reboots, and plenty of other media surrounding Star Trek. Their show was definitely one of the most, if not the most, influential shows of the 1960s. Batman was a 1960s TV adaptation of the 1939 comic series by the same name. It first aired on January 12, 1966 on ABC. This show starred Adam West as Batman and Burt Ward as Robin. The show itself was a silly spoof of the comics, with its goofy costumes and sets and moral lessons like the importance of wearing your seatbelt. The plot followed the dynamic duo Batman and Robin as they looked for clues to find the supervillain of that current episode and foil his or her evil plot. The cultural impact of the show was monumental. Total merchandise sold for the show was topped only by Star Wars. Bonanza. Bonanza was a Western TV show that first aired on September 12, 1959 on NBC. Set in the 1860s in a town near Virginia City, Nevada, Bonanza followed the lives of the Cartwrights and their adventures in the Wild West. It starred Lorne Greene as Ben Cartwright, Pernell Roberts as Adam Cartwright, Dan Blocker as Eric Haas Cartwright, and Michael Landon as Little Joe Cartwright. The show was popular not only for its Western themes but also for its ability to involve serious issues in their episodes surrounding family. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood first aired on February 19, 1968 on NET, later switching to PBS in 1971. Generations of children know Mr. Rogers as their friend and neighbor. Hosted by Fred Rogers, the educational children's show discussed different issues, some as simple as tying your shoes, others more serious, such as divorce. Mr. Rogers also showed things like factories and how certain things were made, and did crafts as well. The trolley brought the children watching into another world, the neighborhood of make-believe, with puppets controlled by Rogers. Rogers himself was quite an inspirational man to many of those who knew him, which is obvious from the direction of the show. He once said, "When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" This show was the embodiment of this idea, acting as a helper to the children who had none. The cultural impact of Mr. Rogers is immeasurable, shaping the childhoods of American children and being the good that so many needed in the world.